At 18 years old, Mara had a choice. She could kneel, or she could leave. For most people, that might sound like a simple decision. For an orc in the Iron Tusk clan, it was anything but. The Iron Tusk were not known for patience, or mercy, or second chances. They were known for their blades, their walls, and their absolute refusal to accept anything they considered weakness. And on that cold, ash-gray morning, in the center of the clan's great stone courtyard, Mara had been declared exactly that, weak. She was 18, daughter of Grak the Iron Hand, a blacksmith who had spent his entire life forging weapons for warriors he would never become. Grak had died 2 winters earlier, his lungs finally surrendering to the smoke and the soot that had filled them for 40 years. And with him, the last protection Mara had ever known. She had inherited the forge. Not legally, not officially. Nothing was ever that simple in the Iron Tusk clan, but in the way that mattered. The tools knew her hands. The fire recognized her touch. She had spent years alongside her father, learning every fold of the metal, every whisper the iron made when it was ready, and every groan it gave when she pushed too hard. It was hers. Not because someone had given it to her, but because she had earned it. One blister and one bruise at a time. But the Iron Tusk clan did not recognize earned things. They recognized claimed things. And Elder Vroth had very specific ideas about who had the right to claim what. Vroth was not cruel in the way that villains in old stories are cruel. He didn't enjoy suffering for its own sake. He was something more calculated than that. He believed, with every bone in his body, that the clan came first, the warrior caste came second, and everything else, everyone else, existed in service of those 2 things. In his world, a young orc girl who preferred a hammer to a sword, who spent her nights reading old trade documents rather than training in the yard, who had never once asked to be given a blade or a rank, or a place in any war band, was not an asset. She was a liability. The decision had been made weeks before it was ever announced. Mara could see it in the way the elders stopped greeting her in the corridors, in the way the warriors who used to come to the forge for repairs began arriving less and less frequently, in the way even the clan's youngest apprentices, children who had once watched her work with wide and curious eyes, had begun to look past her, through her, as if she was already gone. And then, one morning, she was called to the courtyard. She went because she had nothing left to lose by going. The courtyard was full. Not every member of the Iron Tusk attended, but enough. Enough to make a statement. Elder Vroth stood at the center, his gray-green skin weathered and deeply lined, his single remaining eye sharp and utterly emotionless. He did not shout. He did not perform. He simply spoke, in the flat and final tone of a man announcing something that had already been decided a very long time ago. The forge belongs to the clan. That was it. 4 words. 4 words that erased 2 years of her work, 2 decades of her father's work, and every quiet plan she had ever made for the life she was trying to build. 4 words that took the one thing she had left and handed it to someone else without ceremony, without apology, and without any particular interest in what she might say in response. She said nothing. Not because she didn't have words. She had too many of them, piling up behind her teeth like water behind a cracked dam. But she had learned, somewhere along the way, that some rooms do not want your words. Some rooms have already decided, and speaking into a space that has already made up its mind is not courage. It is just noise, She turned and walked away. No one stopped her. No one called her back. No one followed. She collected what she could carry: a worn leather pack, a few days' worth of dried meat and flatbread, a water skin, a bedroll, and a single small hammer she had forged herself in the first year after her father's death, the first thing she had ever made entirely alone. She left the rest. She did not look at the forge as she passed it. She did not allow herself that. She walked through the gates of the Iron Tusk clan just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, painting the ash-gray sky in a thin, pale gold. And she did not look back. Not once. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to this channel and leave a like, because this story is going to take you somewhere you did not expect, and you will want to be here for every part of it. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. We read every single one, and it means more than you know. Now, let's go back to where we left off. The Ashwood Ravines were not a place that people chose to enter. They were, depending on who you asked, either a long stretch of dead woodland carved into the earth by some ancient geological violence, or the site where the Goblin war cannons had leveled an entire hillside 30 years ago during the last great conflict. The truth, as it usually was probably somewhere in between. The trees were not entirely dead. Some of them still grew, bent and gnarled, pushing through layers of pale gray ash that had never fully settled back into the earth. The air carried a faint metallic taste. The sky above the ravines was always slightly hazier than everywhere else, as if the atmosphere itself had not entirely recovered from whatever had happened there. It was, by almost every measure, a miserable place to walk. Mara walked there anyway, not because she wanted to, because it was the only direction that made sense. The Iron Tusk clan's territory spread south and west, following the foothills and the trade roads. Going east meant the open plains, and the open plains meant exposure. No shelter, no cover, no way to disappear. Going north meant the gray waste, and the gray waste meant death in a much more immediate and straightforward way than the ravines. The ravines, at least, had cover. The first day was the worst. Not physically. Physically, she had walked farther and harder during clan training runs, back in the years when she had still been expected to participate in them. No, the first day was the worst emotionally, because the first day was when reality had not yet settled in. Her mind kept doing the thing that minds do when they refuse to accept something. It kept generating alternatives. Maybe the elders would reconsider. Maybe someone would send a runner after her. Maybe she had misread the situation entirely, and if she just turned around and went back, she would find everything as it had been. She knew, rationally, that none of those things were true. But knowing something rationally and feeling it as a settled fact are two different things. And the first day was the day when those two things had not yet caught up with each other. By nightfall, she had covered roughly 12 miles. She made camp in the hollow of a collapsed ravine wall, scraping together enough dry branches to build a fire, small enough not to attract attention, and large enough to keep the cold from becoming dangerous. She ate a portion of the dried meat. She drank carefully from the water skin. She did not sleep for a very long time. The second day was better, because it was worse. The cold had worked its way into her joints overnight, and her left knee, an old injury from a forge accident, never quite right since, throbbed with every step. The dried meat was already half gone, which meant rationing was going to be more aggressive than she had planned. The ash-covered ground was uneven and treacherous, in ways that were not always visible until you were already mid-step, and she twisted her ankle twice before mid-morning. And then it rained. Not a dramatic, cleansing downpour, but the worst kind. A thin, relentless gray drizzle that soaked through everything slowly and completely, without the decency to feel like it was doing anything at all. The kind of rain that made everything heavier. Her pack, her clothes, her thoughts. She kept moving. The third day, she found water. A thin runoff stream cutting through the ash-gray earth, fed by whatever moisture the ravine walls trapped from the air above. It tasted faintly of minerals, slightly wrong in a way she couldn't quite name, but it was water. She refilled the skin, drank deeply, and kept moving. That same afternoon, she found the remains of what had once been a goblin supply camp. 30 years old, judging by the rust on the metal fragments and the way the collapsed canvas had nearly dissolved back into the ground. She spent an hour picking through it carefully, methodically, a habit her father had drilled into her without ever explicitly stating the lesson. There is always something useful in a place that someone else gave up on. She found 3 intact metal bolts, a coil of wire that had somehow avoided the worst of the corrosion, and a small fragment of what appeared to be an ether crystal, cracked and mostly dead, but with a faint, pale shimmer still visible at its core when she held it up to the dim light. She wrapped the crystal fragment in cloth and put it in her pack. The 4th day, she almost stopped. Not stopped walking. She had stopped walking before and started again. She had learned that stopping was survivable as long as you started again. No, what she almost stopped was something more fundamental than that. She almost stopped believing there was anything on the other side of the walking. She was hungry, properly hungry, not inconveniently hungry. The kind of hunger that had started to affect her concentration, making her steps slightly less deliberate, her thoughts slightly less clear. She had covered well over 40 miles. The ravines stretched ahead of her still, gray and ash-pale and entirely indifferent to her existence. She sat down on a flat rock beside a dead tree and allowed herself, for perhaps 10 minutes, to simply feel how bad everything was. It was not nothing, that 10 minutes. There is a particular kind of relief that comes from stopping fighting a feeling and simply sitting with it instead. From acknowledging, without attempting to immediately solve or suppress it, that yes, this is genuinely terrible. Yes, this is harder than you expected. Yes, the gap between where you are and where you need to be is enormous, and there is no guarantee that you will close it. She sat with that. And then she stood up. She stood up because the alternative was not standing up, and not standing up was not something she was willing to accept. Not yet. Maybe not ever. There was something in her. She had no name for it, and would not have called it hope, because hope felt too fragile for what it actually was. Something harder than hope. Something more like refusal. She refused to be what the Iron Tusk clan had decided she was. She refused to end here. So she picked up her pack, and she kept walking. And it was approximately 40 minutes later, just as the sun had begun to drop toward the ravine walls, that she heard the sound. It was faint, very faint. She might have missed it entirely if the wind hadn't chosen that particular moment to die down. But in that brief pocket of stillness, coming from somewhere below her, from somewhere deep in the ravine, far below the current path, she heard something that did not belong there. A mechanical groan, low, rhythmic, almost like breathing, the sound of metal under pressure, shifting and settling, as if something very large was adjusting its weight. She stopped. She stood completely still and listened, holding her breath. And there it was again, unmistakable, mechanical, alive in the way that machines are alive, not with breath or blood, but with movement and tension and the stubborn persistence of engineered things that have not yet been given permission to stop. She looked down into the ravine. The slope was steep. The bottom was not visible from where she stood, shadowed under an overhang of collapsed rock and the tangled remains of ancient ash trees. Whatever was down there was hidden well, hidden so well that, if she had not been moving slowly and listening carefully in a moment of unusual quiet, she would have walked right past it without a second thought. She was not going to walk past it. She set her pack down, checked the slope stability with her foot, and began to climb down. The descent took nearly 20 minutes. The slope was not just steep, it was actively hostile in the way that geological formations become after decades of rain, frost, ashfall, and the particular carelessness of time. Every handhold she tested had the potential to be a good grip or a crumbling disaster, with very little visual difference between the two. 3 times she had to stop completely, pressed flat against the ravine wall, and wait for her heart rate to calm down before continuing. But the sound was still there, below her. Closer now. More complex. She could hear other notes in it. A faint hissing that spoke of pressure valves. A periodic deep click that felt like some kind of engine cycle. And under all of it, like a musical bass note, a low, continuous vibration that she could feel in her teeth when the wind was right. She kept going down, and then the overhang ended, and she saw it. The Skywrecker 7 was enormous. That was the first thing that registered. Not its shape, not its details, not the extraordinary fact of its existence in this place, but simply its size. It was larger than the Iron Tusk clan's Great Hall, larger than the trading post at Coppergate. It was, by any reasonable measure, the largest thing she had ever seen up close. The sheer physical presence of it, the weight of it, the impossible density of its bulk resting in the ravine like some beached and ancient sea creature, was enough to hold her completely still for almost a full minute. It was a Goblin Zeppelin, or it had been once. Now it was something between a ruin and a monument, a vessel so thoroughly embedded in the earth that it was difficult to tell, in certain places, where the machine ended and the landscape began. The hull was massive, constructed of layered iron plates riveted in the precise, almost obsessive fashion typical of Goblin military engineering, each plate slightly overlapping the next, each rivet head a slightly different size from its neighbors, as if every individual section had been built by a different craftsman, following the same basic instructions in slightly different ways. The plates were deeply corroded, layered in rust and ash-gray mineral deposit, and in several places the hull had buckled or cracked entirely under the pressure of the ravine walls pressing in from either side. But it was still there. After 30 years, whatever had brought it down, whatever violence had driven it into this ravine and buried it under rock and ash and the creeping patience of the earth, it was still, fundamentally, there. And it was still, in some deep and essential way, alive. She could see the source of the hissing now, a pressure valve midway along the starboard side, cycling open and closed at irregular intervals, venting something that looked like steam, but smelled faintly of burned copper. One of the ether crystal housings, she could see the distinctive hexagonal frame bolted to the hull just forward of what must have once been the main gondola, still held a crystal. And that crystal still held a dim, slow pulse of light. Not much. Not enough to do anything useful. But enough to prove that the ship's core had not entirely given up. She stood at the bottom of the ravine and looked at it for a long time. Then she started looking for a way in. The main entrance was buried under 6 feet of compacted rock on the port side. She spent the better part of an hour working her way around the ship's perimeter, testing hull panels and hatches before she found it. A section of the lower hull, roughly 5 feet wide and 3 feet tall, where a crack in the iron plating had separated just enough to allow entry. The edges were sharp. She tore her sleeve getting through, but once she was inside, she was inside. The interior of the Skywrecker 7 smelled like time. There was no other word for it. Not just rust, not just dust, not just the particular staleness of air that has been trapped in a confined space for decades. All of those things, certainly, but underneath them something else. Something that smelled like memory, like the accumulated presence of hundreds of people who had once moved through these corridors and eaten in these mess halls and slept in these bunks, and who were now entirely gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint chemical imprint of their having been here. She moved carefully. The corridor she had entered was low-ceilinged and narrow, goblin architecture. Goblins were smaller than orcs by a significant margin, and their engineering reflected that. Every doorway she passed was slightly too short, every ladder rung slightly too close together, every surface at a height that made sense for a creature perhaps 2/3 her size. She had to duck repeatedly. Her shoulders brushed both walls of the narrower passages, but the structure was sound, remarkably, improbably sound. Whoever had built this thing had built it to last, and it had largely done so, settling into its resting place over 30 years with a kind of resigned dignity, like a structure that had accepted its fate but refused to collapse entirely. She found the cargo hold first. It was large enough that goblin scale didn't matter, because the ceiling cleared her head by several feet. Most of it was empty, the original cargo long since gone or destroyed in whatever crash had ended the ship's career. But in one corner, she found a stack of sealed goblin ration containers, metal cylinders, vacuum-locked, designed to last decades. She opened one carefully, using the small blade she carried. The contents were not appetizing. Dense, gray-brown blocks of compressed something, with a smell that suggested protein content mixed with the kind of preservative enthusiasm that goblins had always been famous for. She ate 3 of them. They tasted like very old cardboard that had been mildly seasoned with regret. She ate 2 more. That night, she slept in the cargo hold, wrapped in her bedroll, listening to the ship settle around her. The sounds it made were not frightening, once she had been listening to them long enough to understand their rhythms. The pressure valve on the outer hull cycled every 11 minutes. A junction in the ceiling piping made a soft click on every odd hour. Something deep in the ship's lower levels, somewhere she had not yet found, produced a steady low vibration that was almost too low to hear, but could be felt through the floor. It was the most sheltered she had felt in 4 days. The next morning, she explored, systematically, room by room, corridor by corridor, starting from the cargo hold and working forward through the ship. The crew quarters came first, rows of small bunks, built for goblin frames, with personal storage compartments beneath each one. Most were empty. A few still held small artifacts of the ship's former life. Worn playing cards, a cracked leather boot, a folded piece of paper covered in script she couldn't read, a small figurine carved from what looked like bone, depicting some creature she couldn't identify. She moved on. The mess hall was forward of the crew quarters, a long, low-ceilinged room with tables and benches bolted to the floor, designed to stay useful even in rough weather. She found more ration cylinders here, stacked in lockers along the far wall. She inventoried them carefully, enough to last a very long time, if she was careful. Then she found the engineering bay. It stopped her completely. She had been ducking through a low corridor, narrower than the others, marked with warning symbols in angular goblin script. And then the corridor opened up, without warning, into a space that was completely at odds with everything around it. The ceiling here was high, the highest she had found anywhere in the ship. The room itself was wide, well lit by ether crystal clusters mounted along the walls, most of them still holding some degree of charge, casting the space in a pale, amber-tinted glow. Every surface was covered in goblin engineering. Tools racked with precise care along one wall, schematic drawings pinned and layered on a massive drafting table, components and prototypes arranged on shelving that covered 3 walls from floor to ceiling. And it was all still here. 30 years. And it was all still here. She walked to the drafting table first. The schematics were complex, layers and layers of them, each one adding detail to the one beneath, building towards something she couldn't quite see yet, but could feel in the deliberate precision of every line and calculation. She recognized some elements, ether crystal housings, similar to the ones she had seen in the old Goblin supply camp, pressure valve systems, like the one still cycling on the outer hull, propulsion components that bore a distant family resemblance to the mechanisms she had seen in trading vessels at Coppergate. But other elements were completely unfamiliar. She studied them for a long time. Then she went to the tool wall. The tools were extraordinary, not because they were beautiful, though some of them were, but because they were complete. Every tool in its place, every set intact, nothing missing and nothing improvised. A workshop frozen at the moment of abandonment, waiting for hands to pick it up again. Her hands were itching. It was then, as she stood there with her fingers hovering over the tools, and her mind starting to reach toward the question of what this equipment was capable of, that she heard the sound. Not the pressure valve, not the sealing pipe, not the deep vibration from below. Something else. A grinding, mechanical, coming from the far end of the engineering bay, from a large padded chair mounted on a raised platform that she had assumed was empty. It was not empty. She took 3 very fast steps backward. The figure in the chair was not large. It was, in fact, quite small. Goblin scale, which meant roughly 4 feet tall, even seated, with a body constructed of overlapping metal plates and jointed mechanical limbs that, even in their current state of extreme disrepair, conveyed a certain elegant precision of design. Its face, if it could be called that, was a flat plate of dark metal with 2 lens-style optical units that had, at some point in the last 30 years, developed a significant accumulation of corrosion. Its hands rested on the chair's arms in a position that suggested someone who had simply paused for 30 years. As she watched, the grinding sound came again, and one of the optical units turned, not toward her, just moved, testing its range of motion, finding its limits. A goblin automaton, a mechanical construct built for function, not appearance. This was a working machine, not a decoration. The plating on its chest bore symbols she recognized from the schematics. It was the ship's engineer, or had been, the mechanical intelligence responsible for the Skywrecker 7's maintenance and systems management. It had been here, alone, for 31 years. She stood very still and watched it. The grinding continued, slow and effortful, as various joints tested themselves against decades of corrosion. The optical units moved, stuttered, moved again. She could hear, beneath the external sounds, something that might have been a processing cycle, a faint, rhythmic click deep inside the chest cavity, like a mechanical heartbeat. It was trying to wake up. She crossed the room slowly, carefully, giving it time to register her presence without being startled. She crouched in front of the chair, bringing herself to its level. The optical units rotated toward her, stopped. The processing click sped up slightly. She pulled the cracked ether crystal fragment from her pack. The optical units went still. Then, with enormous care, she located the crystal housing port on the automaton's left forearm, a hexagonal slot, standard goblin design, empty and corroded but structurally intact, and she fitted the fragment into it. The fragment was too small. She knew it was too small even before she tried. But it was something, and sometimes something was the difference. The automaton shuddered. The processing click became audible. And then, in a voice that sounded like gravel being slowly sorted by machinery that had not been used in a very long time, the construct spoke. System, partial reboot, power, insufficient, power, insufficient, optical function, 42%, auditory function, 61%, designation, ticker, Chief Engineering Construct, Skywrecker 7, duration of dormancy, calculating, 31 years, 4 months, 17 days, status of vessel, unknown, status of crew, unknown, status of mission. The voice paused. The optical units moved again, and this time they focused, properly focused, both of them, on Mara's face. You are not Goblin. No, she said. You are Orc. Yes. Another pause. Are you the maintenance crew? She looked at the automaton, at the engineering bay around them, at the schematics on the drafting table, the tools on the wall, the impossible preserved fullness of this space that had been waiting, silently, patiently, for someone to come back to it. I think, she said slowly, that I might be. She named him Ticker, not immediately. The name came after about a week of cohabitation, after the rhythmic internal processing click had become as familiar to her as the pressure valve cycle and the sealing pipe, after she had grown accustomed to the sound of his voice narrating observations about the ship's state of repair in the flat, precise tones of a machine that had been designed to document and catalog, and had been doing so, in some reduced capacity, for 31 years. Ticker did not object to the name. He observed, with his characteristic emotional flatness, that he had not had a designation applied to his external interface before, and that Ticker was an acceptable substitute for the 17-digit serial code stamped on his lower spine, which he had shown no ability to reproduce correctly on 3 consecutive attempts. The first order of business was power. Without sufficient ether crystal charge, Ticker's functions remained severely limited. His mobility was entirely offline, his higher processing functions intermittent, and his knowledge access incomplete. He could communicate. He could observe. He could, on good days, access and narrate portions of the Skywrecker 7's engineering documentation, but he could not move from the chair, could not assist physically, and could not guarantee the accuracy of any information he provided when his charge dropped below a certain threshold. So Mara went looking for crystals. The ship's original crystal inventory had been depleted before the crash. Not in the crash itself, Ticker explained, but in the months leading up to it. The Goblin-Orc War had created a crystal shortage that every vessel had felt, and the Skywrecker 7's reserves had been run down to near zero in the final campaign before the armistice. What remained was distributed in fragments throughout the ship, stored in emergency housings in walls and ceilings and floor panels, placed there by regulation in case of exactly the kind of situation the ship now found itself in. She spent 2 full days locating every fragment. It was meticulous, systematic work, Ticker directing her from memory to every regulatory housing location, Mara climbing and crawling and squeezing through spaces not built for her frame to retrieve each one. Some were useless, fully depleted, the crystal matrix shattered and dark. Some retained partial charge. 3, sealed in a deep storage housing in the lower hull that had been protected from the worst of the crash, were in reasonable condition. She brought them all to Ticker. He directed her, with precise and patient instruction, in how to consolidate the remaining charge using the engineering bay's crystal management equipment. The process took most of a day, and its result was a single crystal that, while not full, was substantially better than what they had started with. When she fitted it into Ticker's primary housing, the difference was immediate. He stood up, not gracefully. 30 years of disuse had done things to his joint mechanisms that were not going to be resolved by a single charge cycle, and the first time he tried to take a step, he produced a noise that suggested serious structural objections. But he stood, and then, slowly, with the careful and determined patience of a machine that understood the difference between not yet functional and non-functional, he took a step, then another. Mobility, limited, he announced. Improvement trajectory, positive. Assessment, acceptable. She watched him move across the engineering bay, slow and grinding, toward the drafting table. "We will begin," he said, "with the propulsion systems." Learning from Ticker was not like learning from a person. A person would have explained things in terms of what she already knew, building bridges between familiar concepts and new ones, checking for understanding, adjusting for confusion. Ticker did not do this, not because he was unkind, but because his instructional model had been built for Goblin engineers who shared a common foundation of technical education that Mara did not have, and that Ticker had no easy way to account for. So the first 2 weeks were hard. He would explain a concept. She would nod, because she was following the words. Then she would attempt to apply it, and the result would make clear that she had understood the words, but not the concept behind them. Ticker would pause, process, and then try again in a slightly different way. Repeat, fail, retry. But she was not starting from nothing. Her father had taught her blacksmithing in the way that good teachers teach things, not as a set of rules to memorize, but as a conversation between the craftsman and the material. Iron has a voice, Grack used to tell her. Learn to listen to it. The hammer doesn't force the metal. It persuades it. You are not imposing your will. You are finding the shape that was already there and helping it arrive. She had internalized that lesson so completely that she had stopped hearing it as instruction and started simply doing it, listening to materials, feeling for the shape that wanted to emerge, working with the grain of things rather than against it. And goblin engineering, she discovered, was not as different as it looked. The principles were different. The scale was different. The components were unlike anything she had used before. But underneath all of that, the fundamental conversation, the one between the craftsman and the material, between intention and constraint, between what you want to build and what the available reality will allow, that was the same. It was always the same. Once she understood that, the learning began to accelerate. Ticker noticed, "Your comprehension rate has increased by 37% over the last 8 days," he observed one afternoon as she correctly identified a fault in a pressure valve assembly before he had finished explaining what she should be looking for. "I stopped trying to memorize and started listening," she said. He processed this. "Clarify. You were teaching me goblin engineering as if it was a collection of facts. It isn't. It's a collection of conversations. Once I stopped trying to remember the words and started trying to hear what the components were telling me." She gestured at the disassembled valve in her hands. "This one is stressed along the seam here. It has been compensating for a misalignment somewhere upstream, probably for years before the crash." Another processing pause. "That is accurate," Ticker said. "You identified a fault that required manual inspection to diagnose, without the diagnostic equipment." "I have hands," she said, "and I have been listening." The months that followed were the most difficult and the most alive of her life. She fell into a rhythm that felt, in some deep and essential way, like the life she had been trying to build before everything had been taken from her, but larger. The forge work she had done at the Iron Tusk had been real and good, but it had been contained. Components, parts, things for other people's purposes. Here, in the Skywrecker 7's engineering bay, with Ticker's knowledge in her own hands and the extraordinary resources of a goblin war vessel's workshop, the work expanded in every direction at once. She repaired, she learned, she modified. The propulsion system came first, because nothing else mattered if the ship couldn't eventually move. The crystals that powered the propulsion were the most depleted in the ship. As Ticker had explained, they were always the first systems drawn down in a power crisis, because propulsion required the most energy and was the most dangerous to lose. Working from Ticker's documentation and her own growing understanding of the crystal systems, she developed a method of using the engineering bay's forge equipment to partially restore crystal matrices by fusing fragments, a technique that was explicitly not in any goblin manual that Ticker repeatedly referred to as theoretically uncertain. And that worked. Not perfectly, not consistently, but with increasing reliability over dozens of iterations as she refined the process. "Theoretically uncertain," she told him after a particularly successful fusion, "just means nobody wrote it down yet." "That is an imprecise definition of uncertain," he said. "Write it down then," she said. "I will sign it." He did write it down. She had started to notice that Ticker documented everything, not just the technical specifications of what she built, but the process, the method, the logic of how she arrived at her solutions. His documentation files, which she could access on the engineering bay's terminal, were growing steadily longer. She asked him about it once, why he was recording all of it. He was quiet for slightly longer than his standard processing pause. The Skywrecker 7 was built by 642 goblins over a period of 11 years, he said finally. None of them are alive. The ship exists. Their knowledge, absent documentation, does not. I do not intend to make the same error twice. She looked at him for a moment. You were here the whole time, she said. When the crew left, when the ship crashed, you were here. I was dormant, he said. There is a distinction. Were there others? Other automatons? 3. They did not survive the crash. A pause. I have been alone here for 31 years, 4 months, and 22 days. She didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't anything to say that would be adequate. But she noted it, the way she noted everything important. Quietly, carefully, holding it in the part of her mind that filed things away for later, when understanding might be possible. The first time the main engine crystal ignited, they were both standing in the lower hull. It was, by any engineering standard, a modest event. The crystal Mara had rebuilt from 6 separate fragments powered up to 18% capacity, which was, as Ticker carefully explained, far below anything operationally useful. The ship did not move. The propulsion array did not engage. No observable external change occurred. But the hum filled the lower hull like a living thing, low and deep and resonant, the same frequency she had been feeling in her teeth for months. But full now. Complete. No longer the dying vibration of residual charge, but the active pulse of a system awake and running. The ether crystal in its housing was lit from the inside, a deep, steady amber glow that pulsed at a rate she had come to learn was healthy, was correct, was right. She stood very still and listened to it. She had not cried since leaving the clan. She had not allowed herself to. There was a part of her, a part she did not examine too closely, that had decided crying required some belief that things could be otherwise, that the situation was wrong and might someday be right. She had not been certain of that, and so she had not cried. She cried now, not from sadness, from something she didn't have a clean name for, something that sat at the intersection of exhaustion and relief, in the specific physical satisfaction of work that has finally answered back, of a thing that was broken beginning, cautiously and imperfectly, to be less broken. Ticker did not comment on this. He noted it, because Ticker noted everything. But he did not comment. She was grateful for that. Over the following months, the work shifted. The propulsion system was not going to be finished quickly, and she had made peace with that. But there were other things she could build in the meantime. Things that grew, perhaps inevitably, from spending 8 months in a space and thinking hard about what she needed and what was possible. The forge came first. The Skywrecker 7 had a metalworking station in its engineering bay, designed for maintenance fabrication, built to Goblin specifications, serviceable but small. She expanded it, using structural iron from sections of the ship that were beyond repair, combining it with the forge techniques her father had taught her, and the precision metalwork she had been learning from Ticker's documentation. She built something new. A forge that could work at scales the ship's original equipment had never attempted. A forge where Goblin precision met Orc tradition in something that was, genuinely, neither and both. She made things in it, not weapons. She had no interest in weapons. She made tools, precision tools, built to tolerances that the Iron Tusk clan's forge could never have achieved, combining the weight and durability of orc ironwork with the exacting standards of goblin engineering. She made replacement components for the ship's systems, improving the originals as she went, finding the places where the original designers had compromised on something they shouldn't have, and correcting them. She made a new pressure valve for the outer hull, the one that had been cycling for 31 years, faithful and exhausted, and installed it, and listened to the ship breathe more evenly. And she began to think about what else this ship could be. Not just a shelter, not just a workshop, something larger. She had spent 8 months in the Ashwood Ravines. In that time, she had found signs, scattered, cautious, but unmistakable, of others. Goblin footprints in the ash, an orc scavenging camp, abandoned but recently. A half-elf girl, glimpsed once at the top of the ravine, gone before Mara could call out to her. People in the ravines, all of them for the same basic reason she was there. Nowhere else to go. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about the forge her father had built, the one that had been taken from her. She thought about what it had been, at its best, not just a place where metal was worked, but a place where people came, where problems were solved, where things that were broken were brought to be made useful again. She thought about what this ship could be, with a working forge at its heart and room enough to make it matter. The idea grew slowly at first, and then all at once, the way that real ideas always do. 9 months after she had first descended into the ravine, Ticker told her they had company. He had restored the ship's exterior sensor array 3 weeks earlier, a project she had been pushing toward because the array included environmental monitoring that would give them advance warning of exactly this kind of situation. She was in the lower hull, running propulsion tests, when his voice came through the internal communication system she had repaired earlier in the month. External sensors detecting movement, North Ravine entrance, multiple signatures, estimated count, 22. Armament consistent with organized military unit. She set down the crystal housing she had been working with, very carefully. Orc. Biometric signatures consistent with orc physiology. Armament includes standard Iron Tusk clan pattern blades, shield configurations, and 2 signatures consistent with command rank carrying. She closed her eyes. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this was possible, that the ravines were not so remote as to be truly undiscoverable, that a goblin war vessel that had spent 9 months gradually humming with more and more electrical activity would eventually produce a signal that someone would notice. She had just not known when, and not knowing when was its own kind of comfortable lie, the one that lets you focus on the work in front of you. The work in front of her was no longer the propulsion system. How long until they reached the ship? At current pace, approximately 40 minutes. She stood up and started moving. The 40 minutes felt both much shorter and much longer than they were. She spent them not panicking. She had decided, somewhere in the 9th month of solitude and work, that panic was a tool with a very specific use case, and this was not it. But thinking, planning, going through what she had and what she could use and what the situation actually required. The Iron Tusk clan had come for the ship. She was certain of that before she had even seen them. They had come because someone had detected the power signatures. The ether crystals were not subtle at this point, not when she had spent 9 months bringing them back to life. And the Iron Tusk clan had a long institutional memory for the location of valuable assets. The Goblin-Orc War was 30 years past, but the weapons and vessels of that war were still significant. And a functioning Goblin War Zeppelin was, by any reasonable military calculation, one of the most significant assets one could acquire. She had not built a weapon. She had built a forge, a workshop, a home, an idea about what this space could be for people who needed exactly what she had found here, somewhere that had been abandoned and was willing to be made into something new. The Iron Tusk clan had come to take it away. She was not going to let that happen. She found Elder Vroth at the base of the ravine. He had aged in the 9 months since she had last seen him. Or perhaps it was that she had changed enough that the age she had always been blind to was now visible. He stood at the head of his 22 warriors, a few feet forward from the rest, his single sharp eye scanning the ship with the careful professional assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime calculating the value of things. He was wearing full ceremonial armor, a statement she understood. This was not a scouting mission. This was a declaration. He saw her before she reached the bottom of the slope. He said nothing immediately. He watched her descend the last few feet and step onto the ravine floor, and he watched her walk toward him, and he watched the full 9 months of change that she was wearing, the muscle she had built hauling iron, the confidence she had built making something from nothing, the way she moved through this space as if it belonged to her, because it did. And something moved behind his single eye that might have been recalculation. "Mara," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Flat, final. "Elder Vroth," she said. Her voice was not as he remembered it. She could see that in his face. "The ship," he said. "Is mine," she said. He smiled, not warmly, the kind of smile that a very experienced negotiator produces when they believe the other party does not yet understand the actual terms of the conversation. "You are standing in clan territory. Everything you find in clan territory." "This is not clan territory," she said. "The Ashwood Ravines are neutral ground under the Armistice Charter of the Goblin-Orc War. Specifically, Article 14, Section 3. All territory within the demarcated conflict zone, including the ravine system designated on the attached maps, is held in perpetual neutral status and is not subject to territorial claim by either signatory party." Vroth's smile did not disappear, but it became slightly less certain of itself. "You have been doing research," he said. "I have been doing a lot of things," she said. Behind him, the 22 warriors waited. They were not comfortable. She could see that in the way they held themselves, in the way their eyes moved between her and the ship and back again. They had expected to arrive at an empty vessel, or at most a frightened girl. They had found neither. The ship was alive around her. The hum of the power systems was audible even outside, and several of the ether crystal housings on the hull were visibly lit, pulsing in the amber glow she had spent 9 months building. Vroth took a step forward. "Legal citations don't change the practical reality," he said. "I have 22 warriors, and you have—" He gestured at the ship. "Whatever that is." "Whatever that is," she agreed, "has defense systems." She did not reach for anything. She did not press any button or activate any switch. She simply said it, the way you state a fact. And she watched him process the statement. The Skywrecker 7 had been a war vessel. War vessels had defense systems. Goblin war vessels specifically, had defense systems that were notorious for their ingenuity, their comprehensiveness, and their tendency to remain operational long after every other system on the ship had failed. Because the goblins who designed them had a professional and deeply personal opinion that defense was the last thing you should ever let die. She had spent 3 weeks, starting from month 6, restoring the defense array. Ticker had called it the most energetically investment-efficient system on the vessel. She had called it the most important thing I am going to fix. They had both been right. "You are bluffing," Vroth said. But he did not step forward again. "Ticker," she said calmly, to no one visible. On the hull of the Skywrecker 7, 4 defensive turret housings, which had previously been retracted and invisible, indistinguishable from the general texture of the corroded iron plating, extended. Slowly, with the particular deliberate pacing of machinery that wanted to be very clear about what it was doing. They did not aim at anyone. They simply became visible. Behind Vroth, 3 of his warriors took a step back. One of them took 2. Vroth stood very still. "I built this," she said quietly. "All of it. 9 months, alone, with my own hands. Whatever this ship was when I found it, it is something different now, something I made, and the clan does not get to take what I have made." She paused. "Not again." The last 2 words landed in the air between them, and she watched Vroth hear them. Watched him hear the specific weight of those 2 words. The 9 months of absence, the forge, the silence of no one calling her back, all of it compressed into 2 words. He was not a man given to visible regret, but he was a man given to accurate assessments of situations, and his assessment right now, she could see, was shifting. He looked at the turrets. He looked at her. He looked back at the ship, really looked at it, not as a military asset, but as a thing that had been worked on, that bore the specific marks of intensive, skilled, sustained attention. "The forge smell," he said, almost to himself. "I could smell it from the top of the ravine." "I have been busy," she said. A long silence. "This is not finished," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "It is not. But it is mine." He stood for one more moment. Then he turned, and he walked back up the ravine, and his 22 warriors followed him. She stood at the base of the ravine and watched them go, all the way up and out of sight, and she did not move until she was certain they were gone. Then she turned, and she walked back into the ship. Ticker was waiting in the engineering bay. "Defense systems performed as expected," he said. "Yes," she said. "They will return," he said. "Probably," she said. "We will be ready." She sat down at the drafting table, and she looked at the schematics spread across it, and she thought about the half-elf girl she had seen at the top of the ravine, the orc scavenging camp, the goblin footprints in the ash, all of them out there, all of them for the same reason. "Ticker," she said, "I want to change the plans." He came to stand beside her. "Change them how?" She put her hand on the schematics. "I want to make the ship bigger." 3 months after the confrontation with Elder Vroth, the Skywrecker 7 lifted from the Ashwood ravines for the first time in 31 years. It did not lift gracefully. Mara had not expected grace. She had expected functional, and she had planned for functional, and functional was what she got. The propulsion crystals, rebuilt and recharged and carefully balanced across a new housing array that combined goblin precision with the structural reinforcement of orc metalwork, powered up in sequence according to a startup procedure she and Ticker had written together over 2 weeks of evening sessions. The lift was slow. The ship groaned in places it should not have groaned. One of the secondary stabilizers produced a sound like distant thunder for approximately 45 seconds before settling into normal operation. But it lifted. It rose above the ravine walls, clearing the highest point by a margin of almost 30 feet, and it hung there in the cold morning air of the Ashwood, enormous and improbable, listing perhaps 2 degrees to starboard, trailing a thin haze of ether crystal exhaust that caught the early light in shifting amber and gold. She was standing in the gondola's forward observation window, a space she had cleared and cleaned and repaired the glass on 3 weeks earlier, because she had known this day was coming, and she had known she wanted to see it properly. She looked out at the ravines below her, at the ash-gray landscape she had walked through hungry and cold and almost stopped. 4 days with nothing but a pack and a small hammer, and a refusal she couldn't quite name. At the slope she had climbed down on a guess, following a sound that didn't belong, at the place that had been forgotten. Ticker's voice came through the communication system. Altitude, stable. Propulsion, nominal. All primary systems, operational. Designation, active. Designation, she said. A pause. The ship requires a new designation. The name Skywrecker 7 is no longer accurate. She thought about that for a moment. Call it the Ironwood, she said. The Ironwood, Ticker repeated. Recorded. The word spread slowly, the way that word always spreads in the places where the overlooked people live. Not through announcement, not through official channels, but through the careful, sideways passing of information between people who have learned to be cautious about who they trust. There was a ship in the Ashwood ravines, working, flying, built by someone who was not interested in warriors or wars, or the clan hierarchies that had decided so many of their fates. It carried a forge that could work metal in ways that the standard clan smiths couldn't. It carried a workshop where a goblin automaton with 31 years of accumulated knowledge would teach anyone who was willing to learn. It had space, real space, cleared and fitted and furnished, for people who needed somewhere to be. They came carefully. The half-elf girl was first. She arrived at the ravine entrance on a morning 3 weeks after the first flight, standing very still at the top of the slope, as if she expected to be turned away, or perhaps attacked. She was perhaps 16, with the particular watchfulness of someone who had learned to read the early signs of danger. Mara watched her from the ship's sensor array for several minutes before going out to meet her. She did not say much. She looked at the ship for a long time. Then she said, "Can I stay?" "Yes," Mara said. A goblin named Kess arrived a week later, carrying a pack of tools and a grievance against the Merchant Guild that had dismissed him for filing accurate safety reports about a mining operation. He was followed, over the next month, by an older orc woman named Duna, who had been the healer for a clan that had dissolved and had nowhere to take her knowledge. By 2 young goblins who had been apprenticed to an engineering firm that had closed without warning. By a human boy who said nothing about why he had come and whom Mara did not ask. They were not a clan. Mara was careful about that word, careful about the assumptions it carried, the hierarchies it implied. They were something else. A crew, maybe. She expanded the ship for them, made room, built bunks to fit different frames, from goblin small to orc large, extended the forge bay, created a teaching space where Ticker, who had, over the months, developed opinions about pedagogy that were increasingly difficult to distinguish from genuine enthusiasm, could work with multiple students at once. The ironwood did not stay in the ravines. It moved, slowly at first, staying close to the neutral ground of the armistice zones, learning what it was capable of, testing its limits carefully, then farther, to the edges of the trade routes that the established powers preferred to keep for themselves, to the places where people who had been pushed out of the official economy tried to survive in the gaps. At every stop, they landed and they worked. The forge took commissions, not from the powerful, not from the clans and guilds that had all the resources they needed, but from the ones below them. The independent smiths undercut by guild contracts, the small settlements that couldn't afford official repair crews, the communities that needed things made and had the materials, but not the skills. Mara did not charge what the market would bear. She charged what the work was worth, which was different, and she reinvested in the ship, and in the people on it, and in the network of contacts and knowledge that was slowly, improbably, building around the ironwood wherever it went. They were not wealthy. They were not powerful in any of the traditional ways that power was measured, but they were free, and they were capable, and they were growing. Elder Vroth heard about the ironwood 8 months after its first flight. He heard about it the way that powerful people hear about things they have underestimated, gradually, then uncomfortably, as the reports accumulated and the scale of what had been built became impossible to dismiss. A flying forge operating in the neutral zones, a crew of mixed races and mixed backgrounds, a reputation spreading through the communities that didn't make it into official records, for work that was honest and quality that was real, and a willingness to take the jobs that nobody else would take. He did not send warriors again. She heard, through channels that had become available to her as the Ironwood's network grew, that he had looked at the legal question very carefully after their confrontation. That Article 14 of the Armistice Charter was, in fact, exactly what she had said it was, that the lawyers he had consulted had confirmed without ambiguity that the ship was hers. She did not receive an apology. She had not expected one. What she received instead was silence. And silence, from a man who had taken her father's forge with 4 words, felt like the loudest possible acknowledgement that she had won. She was not interested in winning. She had never been interested in winning. She was interested in building, in teaching, in the particular and undiminishing satisfaction of making things that worked and mattered and lasted. She was interested in the ironwood and the people on it and the places they still hadn't been and the work that was still waiting. There is a specific kind of shock that powerful people experience when they realize that someone they dismissed has been building something real. It is not quite surprise. They knew, in some abstract sense, that the discarded exist and occasionally succeed. It is something more uncomfortable than that. It is the particular discomfort of recognizing, in what has been built from what they threw away, an accurate accounting of their own error, of seeing, in the forge and the ship and the crew and the network and all of it, the specific shape of everything they decided didn't matter. What Mara built shocked people because it was not what they had planned for. It was not supposed to be possible from what she had been given. An orc girl, exiled at 18, walking into the worst part of a dead landscape with a bedroll and a small hammer, and a quality of refusal that she did not yet have a name for. They had not planned for the hammer. They had not planned for the listening. They had not planned for ticker, or the schematics, or the 9 months of work, or the half-elf girl who arrived first, and the others who arrived after. They had not planned for any of it. That was the thing about people who were dismissed as liabilities, as too quiet and too different and too wrong for the spaces they had been assigned. The powerful made their plans based on what they believed the discarded were capable of, and they were almost always wrong. Not because the discarded were secretly stronger or smarter or more capable in ways that matched the powerful's own metrics, but because survival and stubbornness and the specific kind of creativity that grows only in people who have nothing left to lose, those things do not appear on any inventory. They are not measured by the elders at any courtyard gathering. They are not visible in any accounting of assets and liabilities. They are what is left when everything else is taken. And sometimes, not always, not easily, not without cost, they are enough to build something extraordinary from a thing that was forgotten. The ironwood flew its route through the neutral zones for many years after that. It grew. It changed. It was never quite the same ship twice, because the people on it kept working, kept building, kept improving it in the specific ways that people improve things when they care about them. Mara stood in the forward observation window many times in those years, watching the ash-gray landscape pass beneath her, and she thought about the girl who had walked out of the Iron Tusk clan's gates on a cold morning, with a small hammer and a refusal she couldn't name. She thought about her father and the forge and the way iron sounds when it is ready. She thought about Ticker, documenting everything, making sure that nothing learned was lost. She thought about the people who had come to the ironwood with nothing and found something. Not rescue, not luck, but the more durable and more valuable thing that lies beneath both of those. A place where the discarded become the ones who build. We have reached the end of this story, and before you go, I want to say something. From one side of a screen to the other, there are a lot of people watching this who have been told, by someone whose opinion felt like fact, that they were too much of something, or not enough of something else, that what they made didn't count, that what they knew didn't matter, that the space they were in had no room for them. This story is not a promise that every hard road leads somewhere. It is not. Some roads are just hard. But this story is about what is possible when someone refuses to let what has been taken from them define what they can build. When someone learns to listen to what the materials are telling them and works with the grain of what they have rather than the grain of what they were supposed to have. When someone finds a thing that was abandoned and decides it is worth something and proves it. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it found you in a place where you needed finding, please leave a comment. We read every single one. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what part landed hardest. And if you have not subscribed yet, this would be the moment, because the next story is waiting, and you will not want to miss it. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next one.